The handcuffs clicked shut around Robert Hamilton's wrists at exactly 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in January 2025, the sound echoing across the frost-covered driveway of his modest ranch home on Cedar Lane. For 42 years, Hamilton had lived in the same house, worked at the same auto repair shop, and waved to the same neighbors who now stood frozen behind their curtains, watching in stunned silence as deputies led away the man they'd known as a quiet grandfather who fixed their cars and never missed Sunday service at First Baptist Church. Something wasn't making sense to anyone on Cedar Lane that morning, but the DNA evidence sitting in a manila folder tucked under Detective Sarah Mitchell's arm told a different story entirely. The arrest warrant had been signed just 18 hours earlier, the culmination of a genealogy investigation that had consumed Mitchell's life for the past 8 months. As Hamilton shuffled toward the patrol car in his house slippers and bathrobe, his 73-year-old wife, Eleanor, collapsed against their front door, her coffee mug shattering on the concrete steps. She kept repeating the same phrase over and over. There must be some mistake. There must be some mistake. But Mitchell had spent too many sleepless nights cross-referencing DNA markers and family trees to believe in mistakes anymore. Hamilton's neighbors had gathered in small clusters along the street, their breath visible in the cold morning air as they whispered among themselves. The Hendersons from next door remembered how Hamilton had helped them move their piano 3 years ago. The Johnsons across the street recalled how he'd plowed their driveway every winter without being asked. Martha Collins, who lived 2 houses down, still had the wooden birdhouse Hamilton had built for her late husband's memorial garden. These were the details that made everything feel impossibly wrong, yet the science didn't lie. If you're following this investigation, make sure you're subscribed because the evidence we're about to uncover will change everything you think you know about this case. Detective Mitchell had learned to trust the cold precision of genetic markers over the warm familiarity of small-town relationships. But even she felt the weight of what was happening as Hamilton's head disappeared behind the tinted windows of the patrol car. The drive from Cedar Lane to the Marion County Sheriff's Office took 12 minutes, but for Hamilton, it might as well have been a journey back through 4 decades of carefully constructed lies. Mitchell followed behind in her unmarked sedan, the case file spread across her passenger seat like pieces of a puzzle that had taken 42 years to complete. The morning sun cast long shadows across the rural Oregon landscape, illuminating farmhouses and weathered barns that had witnessed generations of secrets. By 7:15 a.m., news of the arrest had already begun spreading through Millfield's tight-knit community of 3,200 residents. The coffee shop on Main Street buzzed with hushed conversations as people tried to make sense of what they'd heard. Hamilton's arrest wasn't just shocking because of the crime he was accused of committing. It was devastating because it meant that for over 4 decades, a killer had been living among them, fixing their cars, coaching Little League, and sitting in the 3rd pew at church every Sunday morning. The man who had changed Mrs. Peterson's oil just last week, who had donated turkeys to the food bank every Thanksgiving, who had quietly paid for the Martinez family's car repairs when money was tight, was now being booked for a murder that had haunted their community since 1983. Eleanor Hamilton sat in her kitchen for hours after the arrest, staring at the half-finished crossword puzzle Robert had been working on the night before. The pencil marks in his careful handwriting seemed to mock her now. 48 years of marriage, and she had never suspected that the gentleman who brought her coffee in bed every morning had been carrying the weight of such a horrific secret. October 15, 1983, started like any other autumn evening in small-town Oregon, with the smell of wood smoke drifting from chimneys and the sound of high school football practice echoing from the local field. Rebecca Walsh had tied her brown hair back in a simple ponytail that evening, the same way she'd worn it every day since starting her job at Murphy's Diner 6 months earlier. The diner sat at the corner of Main Street and Highway 20, a modest establishment with red vinyl booths and a perpetually flickering neon sign that cast pink light across the empty parking lot after closing time. Rebecca was 23 years old that October, a single mother working 2 jobs and attending community college part-time, saving every tip and every dollar toward her dream of nursing school at Oregon State University. Her manager, Tom Murphy, remembered her staying late that night to help with inventory, her dedication as unwavering as her smile. She had volunteered for the extra work because every additional hour meant another step closer to providing a better life for her 3-year-old son, Danny, who was spending the night at her mother's house just 8 blocks away. The last person to see Rebecca alive was Jenny Martinez, a fellow waitress who watched her walk to her car through the diner's grease-stained windows at exactly 9:43 p.m. Rebecca's 1979 Honda Civic sat alone under the single streetlight in the parking lot, its blue paint faded but well-maintained. Jenny later told investigators that Rebecca had seemed tired but happy, talking about picking up Danny the next morning and taking him to the pumpkin patch outside town. She remembered Rebecca checking her watch and mentioning that she needed to stop by Miller's pharmacy before it closed at 10 to pick up antibiotics for Danny's persistent ear infection. The pharmacy was only 4 blocks away from Murphy's Diner, a straight shot down Main Street past the hardware store, the bank, and the small park where children played during the day. It should have been a 5-minute drive, maybe 10 if she caught the single traffic light on red. Rebecca had made this same trip dozens of times, knew every pothole and crack in the asphalt, every house with its porch light burning bright against the October darkness. But Rebecca Walsh never made it to Miller's pharmacy that night. At 9:52 p.m., pharmacist David Miller locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed, wondering why Rebecca hadn't come by for Danny's medicine like she'd promised. At 10:15 p.m., Rebecca's mother, Helen, called Murphy's Diner looking for her daughter, worry creeping into her voice when Tom Murphy told her Rebecca had left over half an hour earlier. By midnight, Helen Walsh had driven the route between the diner and the pharmacy 6 times, her headlights cutting through the fog that had begun to roll in from the Coast Range. She checked the hospital, called the few friends Rebecca had made since moving to Millfield, and even drove by the community college campus where Rebecca took her evening classes. The Honda Civic was nowhere to be found, and Rebecca had simply vanished into the Oregon night. The first 24 hours of any missing person case are crucial, but in 1983, the Marion County Sheriff's Department had limited resources and outdated equipment. Deputy Frank Morrison took Helen Walsh's report at 12:47 a.m. on October 16th, his typewriter keys clicking slowly as he recorded the basic details. Missing female, age 23, last seen at Murphy's Diner. The department's single patrol car covered over 400 square miles of rural Oregon, and with no signs of foul play, Rebecca's disappearance was initially treated as a possible voluntary departure. But Helen Walsh knew her daughter. Rebecca would never leave Danny, would never disappear without a word. Something had happened during those missing 9 minutes between Murphy's Diner and Miller's pharmacy, something that would shatter the illusion of safety that small towns like Millfield had wrapped around themselves like a comfortable blanket. The search for Rebecca Walsh ended at 11:47 a.m. on October 18, 1983, when volunteer searcher Michael Turner stumbled over what he initially thought was a pile of discarded clothing near Mill Creek, approximately 2.5 miles northeast of downtown Millfield. Turner, a local rancher who had known Rebecca from her occasional visits to Murphy's Diner, called out for the other searchers before he fully comprehended what he had found. The scream that escaped his throat when recognition dawned would haunt him for the rest of his life. Rebecca's body lay partially concealed beneath a fallen Douglas fir, her waitress uniform torn and stained with 3 days of Oregon rain. The violence that had been inflicted upon her was immediately apparent to Sheriff Douglas McLeod, who arrived at the scene within 20 minutes of Turner's discovery. McLeod had been sheriff of Marion County for 12 years, had worked traffic accidents and domestic disputes, had seen the aftermath of hunting mishaps and farm equipment tragedies, but nothing had prepared him for the savage brutality that confronted him in those dark woods. The crime scene stretched across an area roughly 40 feet in diameter, marked by broken branches, disturbed soil, and evidence of a prolonged struggle. Rebecca's purse was found 15 feet from her body, its contents scattered across the forest floor like pieces of a life interrupted. Her car keys glinted in the filtered sunlight beneath a pile of wet leaves, and her nurse's aid textbook lay open to chapter 7, the pages swollen with moisture and stained with blood. Dr. Patricia Hoffman, the county coroner, arrived from Salem at 2:30 p.m., her station wagon loaded with equipment that seemed woefully inadequate for the task ahead. The preliminary examination revealed multiple stab wounds to Rebecca's torso and defensive injuries to her hands and forearms that spoke of a desperate fight for survival. The killer had used what appeared to be a hunting knife or similar fixed-blade weapon, striking with a fury that suggested either intimate knowledge of the victim or a level of rage that defied comprehension. What disturbed the investigators most was the methodical nature of the attack. This wasn't a crime of sudden passion or opportunity gone wrong. Someone had taken time with Rebecca Walsh, had inflicted wounds that were designed to cause maximum suffering before delivering the final fatal strikes. The positioning of her body, partially hidden but not completely concealed, suggested that the killer wanted her to be found, wanted the community to understand what had happened in their peaceful corner of Oregon. The evidence collection process took 6 hours, with deputies photographing every fallen leaf, every broken twig, every drop of blood that had soaked into the rich Oregon soil. Sheriff McLeod knew that his department lacked the sophisticated forensic capabilities of larger jurisdictions, but he meticulously documented everything, hoping that someday technology might catch up to the questions this crime scene raised. Samples of blood, hair, and other biological evidence were carefully preserved in the county evidence room, stored in manila envelopes and cardboard boxes that would sit untouched for decades. News of Rebecca's murder spread through Millfield like wildfire, transforming a community that had never known real violence into a place where parents began locking their doors and walking their children to school. The Miller family, who owned the pharmacy where Rebecca had planned to pick up Danny's medicine, closed their store early that evening and didn't reopen for 3 days. Tom Murphy posted a handwritten sign on the diner's front door, announcing that they would be closed indefinitely out of respect for Rebecca and her family. The funeral parlor on Elm Street had never handled a murder victim before, and the whispered conversations in grocery stores and church pews all centered around the same horrifying question: who among them was capable of such violence? The answer, as they would learn 42 years later, had been hiding in plain sight all along. Attending the same community meetings, shopping at the same stores, and expressing the same shock and outrage as everyone else when Rebecca Walsh's brutalized body was discovered in those dark woods outside town. Rebecca Ann Walsh had arrived in Millfield on a cold February morning in 1983, driving a loaded Honda Civic with her 3-year-old son, Danny, strapped into a car seat that had seen better days. She was fleeing an abusive relationship in Portland, carrying everything she owned in 2 suitcases and a cardboard box, searching for the kind of fresh start that only small towns seem to promise. Her mother, Helen, had moved to Millfield 6 months earlier to care for Rebecca's ailing grandmother, and the modest apartment above Davidson's hardware store represented hope for a young woman who had known too little of it in her 23 years. Those who knew Rebecca during her 8 months in Millfield remembered a woman whose gentle smile masked a fierce determination to build something better for herself and her son. She enrolled in the Certified Nursing Assistant program at Chemiqueta Community College, driving the 30-mile round trip to Salem 3 evenings a week, after finishing her shifts at Murphy's Diner. Her instructor, Barbara Chen, later recalled how Rebecca would arrive with textbooks covered in sticky notes and margins filled with careful handwriting, studying medical terminology and patient care procedures with the intensity of someone who understood that education was her pathway to independence. The other students in Rebecca's CNA program knew her as the quiet one, who always sat in the front row, who asked thoughtful questions about wound care and medication administration, who stayed after class to practice taking blood pressure readings on the training mannequins. She had told Barbara Chen about her dream of eventually becoming a registered nurse, of someday working in a hospital where she could make a real difference in people's lives. The scholarship application for Oregon State University's nursing program was found in her purse on October 18th, completed in her careful cursive and ready to be mailed. Danny Walsh was the center of his mother's universe, a precocious child with Rebecca's dark eyes and an infectious giggle that could light up Murphy's Diner on the slowest Tuesday afternoon. The waitresses would take turns entertaining him when Rebecca had to bring him to work during school breaks, teaching him to count by stacking sugar packets and letting him color on the backs of order pads. Tom Murphy had initially been reluctant to hire a single mother, but Rebecca's work ethic and Danny's charm had won over the entire staff within weeks. Rebecca's apartment above the hardware store was small but immaculate, decorated with Danny's artwork and filled with the textbooks and nursing journals that represented her future. Mrs. Davidson, who owned the building, remembered hearing Rebecca read bedtime stories to Danny every night, her voice carrying through the thin walls as she brought fairy tales to life. The bookshelf in their living room held equal parts children's picture books and medical reference guides, a testament to Rebecca's dual role as devoted mother and ambitious student. The few friends Rebecca had made in Millfield spoke of her generosity despite her limited means. When the Martinez family's car broke down during a particularly cold snap in March, Rebecca had quietly paid for the repairs, telling Tom Murphy to take the money from her tips without telling anyone where it came from. She volunteered at the elementary school's reading program, helping struggling students practice their letters and numbers during her lunch breaks. These acts of kindness were discovered only after her death, when people began sharing memories of a young woman who gave freely of herself despite having so little to spare. Rebecca's relationship with her mother Helen was complicated by years of distance and regret, but moving to Millfield had given them a chance to heal old wounds. Helen would babysit Danny while Rebecca attended evening classes, and the two women had begun planning for a future that included Rebecca's nursing career and Danny's education. They talked about maybe buying a small house together, about creating the stable family environment that Rebecca had never known as a child. The cruelest aspect of Rebecca's murder was not just the life that was taken, but the future that was stolen. Her nursing school acceptance letter arrived in the mail 4 days after her funeral, a brutal reminder of dreams that would never be realized. Danny, too young to fully understand why his mother wasn't coming home, would ask Helen for months afterward when Rebecca would return from her long trip. The scholarship money that Rebecca had saved for her education, kept in a coffee can in her bedroom closet, was eventually used to pay for her funeral expenses and a small headstone that read simply, "Beloved Mother and Daughter." Sheriff Douglas McLeod had seen enough crime scenes in his 12-year career to know that the murder of Rebecca Walsh was unlike anything that had ever happened in Marion County. The methodical brutality, the remote location, and the complete absence of witnesses created an investigative challenge that stretched his department's capabilities to their breaking point. With only 4 deputies covering over 400 square miles of rural Oregon, McLeod found himself coordinating the largest criminal investigation in the county's history, with resources that belonged more to the 1950s than the 1980s. The evidence room at the Marion County Sheriff's Office became the nerve center of the investigation, its metal shelves lined with manila envelopes containing blood samples, fiber evidence, and photographs that documented every horrific detail of Rebecca's final moments. McLeod had requested assistance from the Oregon State Police, but their forensic laboratory was backlogged for months, and advanced DNA analysis wouldn't become available for criminal investigations for several more years. The investigation would have to rely on traditional police work, witness interviews, and the kind of methodical detective work that solved cases through persistence rather than technology. Deputy Frank Morrison emerged as the lead investigator, a 28-year-old former Marine whose attention to detail compensated for his lack of experience with major crimes. Morrison spent his days driving the back roads between Millfield and the crime scene, timing various routes and searching for any evidence that might have been overlooked. He interviewed every resident within a 5-mile radius of Mill Creek, documenting alibis and recording conversations that revealed the intricate web of relationships, grudges, and secrets that existed beneath Millfield's placid surface. The first significant breakthrough came when Morrison discovered that Rebecca's Honda Civic had been found abandoned on a logging road approximately 1 mile from where her body was discovered. The car had been there for at least 2 days before being spotted by a timber company foreman, its doors unlocked and keys missing. Inside, Morrison found Rebecca's work schedule from Murphy's Diner, a half-empty pack of gum, and a receipt from Miller's Pharmacy, dated 3 days before her murder, for Danny's previous prescription of antibiotics. The positioning of the vehicle suggested that Rebecca had either been forced to drive to the remote location or had been abducted, and her car moved there afterward. Tire impressions in the soft soil around the Honda indicated that at least one other vehicle had been present, but the October rains had degraded the tracks beyond the point where they could provide meaningful identification. Morrison spent hours crouched in the mud, making plaster casts of partial impressions that would ultimately prove too fragmentary to be useful. 3 suspects emerged from the initial investigation, each presenting compelling motives but insufficient evidence for arrest. The first was Rebecca's ex-boyfriend from Portland, James Sullivan, a construction worker with a history of domestic violence who had been calling Rebecca's apartment in the weeks before her death. Sullivan's alibi placed him at a job site in Bend on the night of October 15th, but Morrison discovered discrepancies in the timesheet records that suggested Sullivan could have made the 3-hour drive to Millfield and back without being missed. The second suspect was Marcus Rivera, a regular customer at Murphy's Diner who had been making increasingly aggressive advances toward Rebecca, despite her polite rejections. Several witnesses reported seeing Rivera in the diner's parking lot on multiple occasions, and he had no verifiable alibi for the night of the murder. When questioned, Rivera became hostile and uncooperative, demanding to speak with a lawyer before providing any additional information. The third suspect emerged from an unexpected source, Rebecca's nursing school classmate, David Thompson, who had been pressuring her for dates and had become increasingly erratic after she declined his invitations. Thompson lived alone in a cabin outside Salem and had extensive knowledge of the rural areas where Rebecca's body was found. His background included military service and hunting experience, suggesting familiarity with the type of knife used in the attack. Morrison conducted extensive interviews with all 3 suspects, but the limitations of 1983 investigative techniques meant that much of the evidence remained circumstantial. Without DNA analysis, fingerprints from the crime scene, or witnesses to the actual abduction, the case began to stagnate within the first month. The Oregon State Police forensic analysis of blood and hair samples would eventually exclude Sullivan and Rivera as contributors, but Thompson's samples were contaminated during processing and proved inconclusive. The Rebecca Walsh murder case officially remained active in the Marion County Sheriff's Office files, but by the winter of 1984, the investigation had effectively gone cold. Deputy Morrison had exhausted every lead, interviewed every potential witness, and followed up on dozens of tips that ultimately led nowhere. The three primary suspects had moved on with their lives. James Sullivan relocated to California, Marcus Rivera took a job in Washington state, and David Thompson completed his military service and disappeared into anonymity. The case file grew thick with reports and evidence logs, but no closer to a resolution. Sheriff McLeod retired in 1989, taking with him the institutional memory of those crucial first months when the trail was still fresh and hope still existed that Rebecca's killer would be brought to justice. His replacement, Sheriff Carol Rodriguez, inherited dozens of unsolved cases, but the Walsh murder remained the one that haunted the department most deeply. Rodriguez would occasionally assign new deputies to review the file, hoping that fresh eyes might spot something that had been missed. But the limitations of 1980s forensic science meant that critical evidence remained locked away in evidence envelopes, waiting for technology that didn't yet exist. Helen Walsh spent the first decade after her daughter's murder consumed by grief and an obsession with finding answers that seemed to slip further away with each passing year. She attended every town council meeting, lobbied for increased sheriff's department funding, and maintained a correspondence with the Oregon State Police that filled 2 filing cabinets in her small apartment. When she died of a heart attack in 1995, Helen took with her 12 years of unanswered questions and a mother's desperate need to know why her daughter had been taken from her in such a brutal way. Danny Walsh grew up in the shadow of his mother's unsolved murder, raised by his grandmother Helen and later by foster families, when Helen's grief made caring for a growing boy impossible. He left Millfield at 18, unable to bear living in a town where everyone knew him as the son of the murdered woman. The college fund that Rebecca had been building became Danny's inheritance, allowing him to attend Oregon State University and eventually become the nurse that his mother had dreamed of being. But success couldn't fill the void left by questions that would never be answered. The case file moved from active investigation to cold case storage in 1993, 10 years after Rebecca's murder. By then, the original evidence had been transferred to newer storage facilities, catalogued with computer systems that were state-of-the-art for their time, but primitive by later standards. The blood samples and hair evidence collected from the crime scene were preserved in a freezer unit that hummed quietly in the basement of the new county building, waiting for advances in forensic science that were still decades away. As the years turned into decades, Millfield itself began to change. New families moved in, drawn by affordable housing and the promise of small-town life. The old Murphy's Diner became a Mexican restaurant, then a pizza place, then finally a vacant building with boarded windows. The hardware store where Rebecca had lived was torn down to make way for a parking lot. Physical reminders of her life gradually disappeared, but the case remained embedded in the town's collective memory, like a splinter that never quite healed. Sheriff Rodriguez was replaced by Sheriff Michael O'Brien in 2003. Who was replaced by Sheriff Jennifer Martinez in 2015. Each new administration brought renewed promises to review cold cases, but limited resources and more pressing current crimes meant that the Walsh file remained largely untouched. The advent of DNA analysis in the 1990s had solved other cold cases in the county, but repeated attempts to extract usable genetic material from the Rebecca Walsh evidence had failed due to degradation and contamination. The case might have remained forever unsolved, another tragic reminder of justice denied if not for advances in genetic genealogy that emerged in the late 2010s. Companies like 23andMe and Ancestry DNA had created vast databases of genetic information that law enforcement agencies were beginning to use in conjunction with traditional forensic evidence. Detective Sarah Mitchell, who joined the Marion County Sheriff's Office in 2020, would eventually become the person to bridge the gap between Rebecca Walsh's 1983 murder and the sophisticated investigative tools of the 21st century. But that breakthrough was still years away when the case file was moved to its final storage location in 2010, relegated to a climate-controlled room where it waited alongside dozens of other unsolved crimes for technology to catch up with justice. Detective Sarah Mitchell had been staring at the Rebecca Walsh case file for 3 months when the breakthrough finally came, not from traditional police work, but from a technology that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators who first worked the case in 1983. Mitchell, a 10-year veteran who had transferred to Marion County from Portland's Major Crimes Unit, had made cold cases her specialty, drawn to the puzzle-like nature of investigations where time had obscured crucial details, but also preserved evidence that newer crimes often lacked. The genetic genealogy process began in February 2024, when Mitchell submitted DNA samples from Rebecca's case to Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based company that specialized in using public genealogy databases to identify suspects and victims in cold cases. The DNA sample had been extracted from blood stains on Rebecca's torn uniform, material that had been preserved in the county's evidence freezer for over 4 decades. Previous attempts to analyze the genetic material had failed due to degradation and the limitations of older testing methods, but advances in low copy number DNA analysis and genetic genealogy techniques had opened new possibilities. The process was painstakingly slow and methodical. Parabon's geneticists worked with degraded samples that contained genetic material from multiple sources, requiring sophisticated separation techniques to isolate the killer's DNA from Rebecca's own genetic profile and environmental contamination. The sample was so compromised that traditional CODIS database searches had repeatedly failed, but the newer genealogical approach didn't require perfect samples, only enough genetic markers to build a family tree. Mitchell found herself checking her email obsessively, knowing that the genetic genealogy process could take anywhere from 3 months to 2 years, depending on the quality of the sample and the complexity of the family relationships. She had seen other cold cases solved through similar methods, watching detectives in neighboring jurisdictions arrest suspects who had evaded justice for decades through nothing more than family trees built from public genealogy websites. The preliminary results arrived on a Thursday morning in August 2024, delivered in an email that Mitchell read 3 times before fully comprehending its implications. The genetic profile extracted from Rebecca's clothing had been successfully linked to a family tree that stretched back 5 generations, connecting the unknown killer to descendants who had voluntarily submitted their DNA to genealogy websites in search of their own family histories. The irony wasn't lost on Mitchell that the killer's family members had unknowingly provided the key to solving a crime committed before many of them were born. The family tree that emerged from the genetic analysis pointed to a cluster of relatives in the Pacific Northwest, descendants of Irish immigrants who had settled in Oregon in the early 1900s. Mitchell spent weeks studying birth certificates, marriage records, and obituaries, building profiles of potential suspects who would have been the right age and in the right location to commit Rebecca's murder in 1983. The work was methodical and exhausting, requiring her to cross-reference genealogical data with criminal records, employment histories, and residential information spanning 4 decades. If you're invested in seeing how this investigation unfolds, make sure you stay with us, because the next phase will reveal details that will completely change how you see this case. The genetic genealogy had narrowed the suspect pool to approximately 30 male relatives, but Mitchell needed additional evidence to identify which of these men had been responsible for Rebecca's death. She began the process of elimination by focusing on individuals who would have had access to the Millfield area in October 1983, men who possessed the physical capability to commit such a violent crime, and those whose life patterns suggested they might have crossed paths with Rebecca Walsh. The breakthrough came when Mitchell cross-referenced the genealogical data with Oregon Department of Motor Vehicles records from 1983. One name appeared on both lists, and when she pulled his driver's license photo from that era, Mitchell felt the familiar chill that experienced detectives recognize as the moment when speculation becomes certainty. The man staring back at her from the 41-year-old photograph had been living in Millfield in 1983, had no verifiable alibi for the night of October 15th, and had somehow managed to avoid suspicion during the original investigation despite being perfectly positioned to commit the crime. That man was Robert Hamilton, the quiet mechanic who had been fixing cars and attending church in Millfield for over 40 years, whose arrest on Cedar Lane would shock a community that thought it had moved beyond the shadow of Rebecca Walsh's unsolved murder. The identification of Robert Hamilton as a suspect through genetic genealogy was only the beginning of an investigation that would consume Detective Mitchell's life for the next 6 months. Unlike the original 1983 investigation, Mitchell had the advantage of 4 decades of technological advancement. But she also faced the challenge of building a case against a man who had spent 41 years carefully constructing the perfect facade of respectability and community involvement. The surveillance began in September 2024, with Mitchell and her team documenting Hamilton's daily routines, mapping his movements between his home on Cedar Lane, his job at Peterson's Auto Repair, and his regular activities around Millfield. What they discovered was a man whose life had followed the same predictable patterns for decades, someone who had built an existence so mundane and unremarkable that it served as the perfect camouflage for a killer hiding in plain sight. Hamilton's work schedule at the auto repair shop placed him in town every weekday from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., servicing the cars of neighbors who trusted him with their vehicles and often their personal problems. Mitchell watched through binoculars as Hamilton changed oil, rotated tires, and discussed transmission troubles with customers who had no idea they were confiding in someone capable of such violent brutality. The Mechanics Bay where Hamilton worked was less than 2 blocks from where Murphy's Diner had stood in 1983, close enough that he could have easily observed Rebecca's routines and planned his attack accordingly. The deeper Mitchell dug into Hamilton's background, the more disturbing patterns began to emerge. In 1983, Hamilton had been 25 years old, recently married, and working as a junior mechanic at the same shop where he would eventually become part owner. His supervisor from that era, now deceased, had noted in personnel files that Hamilton occasionally worked late shifts and had keys to the shop, giving him the flexibility to come and go without being closely monitored. More significantly, Hamilton's 1983 pickup truck matched tire impression measurements taken at the scene where Rebecca's Honda Civic had been abandoned. Mitchell spent weeks re-interviewing witnesses from the original investigation, many now elderly or deceased, but those who remained alive provided crucial details that had been overlooked or minimized 4 decades earlier. Jenny Martinez, the waitress who had been the last person to see Rebecca alive, remembered that a pickup truck had been parked across from Murphy's Diner on the night of October 15th, though she hadn't thought it significant at the time. The truck had left the parking lot shortly after Rebecca, heading in the same direction she had driven toward Miller's Pharmacy. The most damaging evidence came from Hamilton's own family members, though they didn't realize the implications of what they were revealing. During casual conversations that Mitchell orchestrated through intermediaries, Eleanor Hamilton mentioned that her husband had been unusually agitated in late October 1983, coming home with muddy clothes and scratches on his hands that he attributed to working on farm equipment. She also revealed that Hamilton had insisted they take a sudden vacation to visit relatives in California just days after Rebecca's body was discovered, a trip that seemed uncharacteristic for a man who rarely left Marion County. The search warrant for Hamilton's property was executed at dawn on December 15, 2024, with forensic teams combing through 40 years of accumulated possessions in search of evidence that might connect him to Rebecca's murder. In the garage, where Hamilton had stored tools and equipment for decades, investigators found a hunting knife collection that included several fixed-blade weapons similar to the one used in Rebecca's killing. More significantly, they discovered a toolbox that contained newspaper clippings about the murder, carefully preserved and hidden beneath layers of legitimate automotive paperwork. The psychological profile that emerged from the investigation painted a picture of a man whose outward normalcy masked a capacity for calculated violence. Hamilton had never been arrested for any serious crimes, had no history of domestic violence, and had successfully maintained relationships with family and friends for over 4 decades. But hidden beneath this carefully constructed facade was evidence of a man who had been obsessed with the Rebecca Walsh case, who had collected details about the investigation and followed its progress through local newspaper coverage and gossip within the community. Mitchell's team discovered that Hamilton had been present at Rebecca's funeral, standing among the mourners who came to pay their respects to a young woman whose life he had brutally ended. Photographs from the service, stored in the Historical Society's archives, showed Hamilton in the background, his face displaying the same concerned expression as other community members who were genuinely grieving Rebecca's death. The audacity of attending his victim's funeral spoke to a level of psychological manipulation that chilled even experienced investigators who had seen the worst of human behavior. The evidence against Hamilton continued to mount throughout the fall and winter of 2024, building toward an arrest that would finally bring justice for a crime that had haunted Millfield for over 4 decades. The interrogation room at the Marion County Sheriff's Office had witnessed thousands of conversations over the years, but nothing quite like the 6-hour session that began at 8:30 a.m. on January 28, 2025, when Robert Hamilton sat across from Detective Sarah Mitchell with his hands folded calmly in his lap. Hamilton had waived his right to an attorney, a decision that surprised Mitchell and suggested either supreme confidence in his ability to maintain his 42-year deception or a subconscious desire to finally unburden himself of the secret that had defined his adult life. For the first 2 hours, Hamilton maintained his innocence with the same quiet dignity he had displayed throughout his arrest and booking. He spoke in the measured tones of a man accustomed to explaining automotive problems to confused customers, patiently addressing each piece of evidence as if it were a simple misunderstanding that could be cleared up through reasonable discussion. The DNA evidence was explained away as cross-contamination, the newspaper clippings as the natural curiosity of a community member concerned about a local tragedy, and his presence at Rebecca's funeral as nothing more than neighborly respect for the dead. Mitchell had interrogated hundreds of suspects during her career, but Hamilton presented a unique challenge. Unlike the desperate criminals and volatile personalities she usually encountered, Hamilton displayed an almost preternatural calm that suggested either complete innocence or a level of psychological control that bordered on the pathological. He asked polite questions about the evidence, complimented Mitchell on her thoroughness, and even expressed sympathy for the Walsh family's decades of suffering, all while maintaining eye contact and showing no signs of the stress that typically accompanied such serious accusations. The breakthrough came when Mitchell introduced photographs from the crime scene, spreading them across the metal table like a gruesome deck of cards. She had seen hardened criminals break down when confronted with visual evidence of their crimes, but Hamilton's reaction was different, more subtle. His breathing changed almost imperceptibly, his pupils dilated slightly, and for just a moment, Mitchell caught a glimpse of something dark and predatory flickering behind his carefully maintained facade of respectability. Hamilton studied the photographs with the clinical detachment of a mechanic examining a damaged engine, commenting on the thoroughness of the 1983 investigation and the quality of the crime scene documentation. But Mitchell noticed that his hands had begun to tremble slightly, and a thin sheen of perspiration had appeared on his forehead, despite the cool temperature in the interrogation room. After 42 years of successfully compartmentalizing his crime, Hamilton was finally being forced to confront the visual evidence of what he had done to Rebecca Walsh. When Mitchell began describing Rebecca's final moments, reconstructing the attack based on forensic evidence and wound patterns, Hamilton's composure finally began to crack. She spoke in clinical terms about the defensive injuries to Rebecca's hands, the multiple stab wounds to her torso, and the evidence suggesting that the attack had lasted several minutes. Hamilton's breathing became more labored, and he began shifting uncomfortably in his chair, the first signs that his psychological armor was developing fractures. The confession, when it finally came, was delivered in the same measured tones Hamilton had used throughout the interrogation, as if he were describing a routine automotive repair rather than a brutal murder. He began by correcting Mitchell's reconstruction of events, providing details about the crime that only the killer could have known. Rebecca had not screamed, he said, because he had immediately covered her mouth. She had fought harder than he had expected, scratching his face and arms before he overpowered her. The attack had occurred not at the crime scene where her body was found, but in his pickup truck after he had forced her to drive with him to the secluded logging road. Hamilton's description of the murder was chillingly matter-of-fact, devoid of emotion or remorse. He explained how he had observed Rebecca's routines for weeks, learning her schedule and identifying the perfect opportunity to intercept her between Murphy's Diner and Miller's Pharmacy. He had chosen October 15th because the weather forecast called for rain, which would wash away evidence, and because he knew Rebecca would be alone and vulnerable during her short drive through the quiet streets of Millfield. The motive, when Hamilton finally revealed it, was both shocking and mundane. Rebecca had rejected his advances when he had approached her at the diner weeks earlier, humiliating him in front of other customers by loudly telling him to leave her alone. In Hamilton's twisted psychology, this public rejection had been an unforgivable insult that demanded the ultimate punishment. He had spent weeks planning her murder, fantasizing about the moment when he would have complete power over the woman who had dared to embarrass him. As Hamilton continued his confession, detailing how he had moved Rebecca's body to the woods and abandoned her car on the logging road, Mitchell realized she was listening to a man whose capacity for violence had been hidden beneath decades of carefully cultivated normalcy. The friendly mechanic who had fixed neighbors' cars and coached Little League had been a facade constructed to conceal a predator who had committed one of the most brutal crimes in Marion County's history and then returned to his everyday life as if nothing had happened. The guilty plea came on March 15, 2025, in a Marion County courtroom packed with reporters, law enforcement officials, and community members who had waited over 4 decades for this moment. Robert Hamilton, now 67 years old, stood before Judge Patricia Morrison, wearing an orange jumpsuit and shackles, his transformation from respected community member to confessed killer complete. The plea agreement would spare him the death penalty in exchange for a full confession and a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. Danny Walsh, now 44 years old and working as a registered nurse in Portland, sat in the front row of the courtroom gallery, finally able to look into the eyes of the man who had murdered his mother when he was just 3 years old. The decades had not diminished the pain of losing Rebecca, but seeing Hamilton in custody provided a sense of closure that Danny had never expected to experience. In his victim impact statement, Danny spoke about growing up without a mother, about the questions that had haunted him throughout his childhood and adulthood, and about the relief of finally knowing that his mother's killer would never hurt anyone else. Eleanor Hamilton sat in the opposite section of the courtroom, her 48 years of marriage to a murderer having aged her beyond her 73 years. She had filed for divorce the day after her husband's arrest, unable to reconcile the gentle man she thought she knew with the monster who had confessed to Rebecca's brutal murder. The revelation that she had shared a bed, a home, and a life with someone capable of such violence had shattered her world in ways that would never fully heal. The impact on Millfield's community was profound and far-reaching. Residents struggled to process the fact that Hamilton had been among them for over 4 decades after committing his heinous crime, attending the same church services, shopping at the same stores, and participating in the same community events as Rebecca's family and friends. The Peterson family, who had employed Hamilton at their auto repair shop for over 30 years, closed the business permanently, unable to continue operating a place where a killer had worked for so long. Detective Sarah Mitchell received commendation from the Oregon State Police and the FBI for her work on the case, but she found little satisfaction in the recognition. The investigation had consumed 18 months of her life and revealed disturbing truths about how easily evil could hide in plain sight. The genetic genealogy breakthrough that had solved Rebecca's murder also raised troubling questions about how many other cold cases might involve killers who had successfully integrated themselves into their communities while their crimes remained unsolved. The evidence room at the Marion County Sheriff's Office finally released the physical remnants of the Rebecca Walsh case to the District Attorney's Office for permanent storage. The manila envelopes and cardboard boxes that had held Rebecca's clothing, the crime scene photographs, and the DNA samples that had ultimately identified her killer were transferred to a secure facility where they would remain as a permanent record of both a horrific crime and the long journey toward justice. The case sparked renewed interest in other cold cases throughout Oregon, with law enforcement agencies submitting genetic evidence to genealogy laboratories in hopes of achieving similar breakthroughs. Rebecca's murder had become a template for how advanced forensic techniques could bridge the gap between decades-old crimes and modern investigative capabilities, offering hope to families who had spent years without answers. For Millfield, the resolution of Rebecca Walsh's murder marked the end of a chapter that had defined the community for over 40 years. The town had grown and changed dramatically since 1983, but Rebecca's unsolved murder had remained a constant reminder of vulnerability and unfinished business. With Hamilton's confession and sentencing, residents could finally move forward without the shadow of an unknown killer living among them. The final entry in the case file was made by Detective Mitchell on the day of Hamilton's sentencing, closing a murder investigation that had spanned 4 decades, multiple sheriff's administrations, and revolutionary advances in forensic science. Rebecca Walsh could finally rest in peace, knowing that her killer would spend the remainder of his life in prison, paying for a crime that had robbed a young mother of her future and left a 3-year-old boy to grow up without the woman who had loved him most. If this case has shown you anything, it's that justice, no matter how long delayed, can still be achieved through the dedication of investigators who refuse to let cold cases remain cold, and through advances in science that give voice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves. Share your thoughts on how genetic genealogy is changing criminal investigations, and make sure you're following our channel for more deep dives into cases where modern science meets decades-old mysteries.